After divorce at 75, I was left penniless. My ex-husband laughed. "Let's see how you survive." But 3 weeks later, a lawyer called me. "Your father died in 1987 and left you $73 million. We've been searching for you for 30 years. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I had been married to Gerald for 52 years. That's longer than most people stay in the same city, longer than most friendships survive, longer than most dreams. 52 years of mornings where I made his coffee, 2 sugars, no cream, and set it on the left side of the table because that was where he always sat. 52 years of holidays, of arguments that ended by Tuesday, of children grown and gone, of grandchildren who called on birthdays. I thought I knew what my life was. I thought I had earned the right to understand it. I was wrong. My name is Margaret Eleanor Whitfield. Everyone called me Peggy. I was 75 years old when Gerald looked across our kitchen table, that same table where I had set his coffee for half a century, and told me he wanted a divorce. He did not look ashamed. He did not look uncertain. He looked, if anything, relieved, as though he had been holding his breath for years and could finally let it go. I remember the October light coming through the window. I remember the sound of a neighbor's dog barking somewhere down the street. I remember my own hands, folded on the table in front of me, and how still they were. That stillness surprised me later, when I thought back on it. I had expected to fall apart. Instead, some part of me simply went quiet, like a room where someone has turned off all the lights. "Peggy," he said, "it's been over for a long time. You know that." Did I know that? I turned the question over in my mind for weeks afterward. There had been distance, yes. There had been years where conversation dried up into schedules and logistics. Who needed the car when the plumber was coming, whether we should invite the Hendersons for Thanksgiving. But I had called that the natural settling of a long life together. I had called it comfort. I had not called it an ending. The truth came out in pieces, the way truth usually does when someone has been careful to bury it. Gerald had been seeing a woman named Diane Holloway for 11 years. 11 years. She was 61 years old, a widow from Columbus who had met Gerald at a regional insurance conference in 2012. I found this out not from Gerald, but from our daughter, Carol, who had known for 2 years and carried the weight of that secret with a kind of grim practicality that broke my heart more than the betrayal itself. "Mom, I didn't know how to tell you," Carol said, sitting across from me in my kitchen 3 days after Gerald had moved his things to a storage unit and checked into a hotel. "I thought maybe it would just end." I looked at my daughter, 50 years old, tired around the eyes, holding her coffee mug with both hands. And I understood that she had been trying to protect me. I also understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that I had been the last person in my own life to know the truth about it. The warning signs. When I looked back, they were everywhere. The way a crack in a wall is obvious once you know to look for it. The conferences that ran longer than scheduled. The new carefulness about his phone. The way he had stopped being irritated by small things, which I had mistaken for personal growth, but which was simply the contentment of a man who had somewhere better to be. Even the way he had started buying new shirts, nicer ones, better colors, which I had thought was vanity, but which was, of course, something else entirely. What does a woman do when she realizes that the life she thought she was living was a set piece? when she understands that her sense of security was built on a foundation that someone else had quietly been dismantling for over a decade. I sat in that kitchen for a long time after Carol left. The coffee went cold. The neighbor's dog stopped barking. The October light shifted and dimmed. And then Gerald called. He was staying at the Marriott on 5th Street, and his voice had that careful, measured quality of a man who has rehearsed what he is going to say. He told me that he intended to file for divorce in 30 days. He told me that he had already spoken to an attorney. He told me that the house would need to be sold to divide the equity, and that given my age and the modest state of our savings, I would need to think practically about my next steps. I said very little. I asked him if there was anything left to discuss. He said he didn't think so. And then, and this was the moment I have returned to again and again in the years since, he said something that I do not think he intended to be cruel, but that landed in me like a splinter that would fester for weeks. He said, "Peggy, let's be honest. What are you going to do at 75? I mean, what do you actually have?" He did not wait for an answer. He said goodnight and hung up the phone. I sat with that question in the silence of my kitchen. What do you actually have? At the time, I thought I had nothing. I had 52 years of a marriage that had apparently been a partial fiction. I had a house that was about to be sold. I had Carol, who loved me but lived in Cincinnati. I had approximately $40,000 in a savings account and a Social Security check that covered my basic bills if I was very careful. I had no idea, none at all, that 3 weeks later I would have something that would change everything. But that evening, I simply sat in the dark kitchen and felt the particular hollow weight of a woman who has been discarded. And I thought, Gerald is right. I have nothing. I would spend the next few weeks learning exactly how wrong I was. The days after Gerald's phone call had a strange, compressed quality. Each one felt both endless and identical. I woke at the same time every morning, made coffee I didn't taste, sat at the kitchen table where Gerald used to sit, and tried to take stock of my situation with the same methodical calm I had always applied to practical problems. I had learned that approach from my father, Arthur Beaumont, who had been a quietly organized man, the kind of man who kept records, who believed that clarity was a form of dignity. My father. I thought about him often during those first raw weeks. He had died in 1987, when I was 37 and newly moved to Dayton with Gerald, who had just taken a position with Midwest Insurance Group. My father's death had been sudden. A cardiac event, his doctor had called it, which was a clinical way of saying that a vital and particular man had simply stopped between one breath and the next. I had been unable to travel back to Memphis for the service because Carol had just turned 3 and Gerald had said the trip was too much. I had mourned my father from a distance, which was a grief I had never entirely finished. But I am getting ahead of myself. In those November mornings, my father was simply a memory, a steady presence in the background of my thinking, the way certain people remain with you, not as a wound, but as a kind of compass. I made a list. That is what I always do when a situation becomes unmanageable. I sat down with a yellow legal pad and I wrote out exactly what I had and exactly what I was about to lose. Assets. The house, valued at approximately $220,000, from which I would receive half after the mortgage was settled. Roughly $75,000. The savings account, $41,200. Social Security, $1,800 a month. A small pension from the school district, where I had worked as an administrative assistant for 20 years before retiring. Liabilities. None, technically. But also, no health insurance beyond Medicare, no family nearby, a body that was 75 years old and had begun to register that fact in various small but persistent ways, a knee that ached in cold weather, a tiredness that sleep did not entirely fix. I looked at the list for a long time. Could I survive on this? Yes, barely, and with very little margin for anything unexpected. I could find a small apartment, one bedroom, somewhere in Dayton, where I knew the streets and the grocery stores and the route to Carol's favorite diner when she visited. I could live quietly and carefully and with almost no room to breathe. Was that what Gerald had meant when he asked what I had? Was that the life he imagined for me while he drove to Columbus on weekends to see Diane Holloway? I felt something shift inside me. Not grief, exactly. Grief I had already begun to work through in those hollow, early mornings. This was something closer to anger, and I want to be precise about what kind of anger it was. It was not hot or irrational. It was the specific, clarifying anger of a person who realizes they have been underestimated. Gerald had laughed. He had actually laughed when I told him I intended to consult my own attorney. "Your attorney," he repeated, in the tone one might use with a child who has announced they intend to fly a plane. "Peggy, you haven't worked in 15 years. You don't have—" He paused, reconsidered, and then said the thing I have never forgiven him for. "Let's just see how you manage." Let's just see how you manage. I hung up the phone and I sat very still for approximately 45 seconds. Then I picked up the yellow legal pad and I wrote at the top of a new page in capital letters, what I am going to do. The plan, in its first rough form, was straightforward. I would hire a divorce attorney, not the young, inexpensive one Gerald had apparently assumed I would settle for, but a competent one, someone with real experience in asset division for long-term marriages. I would ensure that every shared asset was properly documented. I would not accept the first offer. I would not be managed. I had enough money, barely, to retain decent legal counsel if I was careful about everything else. But there was a second item on my plan, one that I almost did not write down because it seemed, even to me, too small and fragile to commit to paper. My father had been a man of modest but real means, not wealthy, but careful. He had owned property in Memphis. He had invested slowly and consistently over decades. And when he died, suddenly, in 1987, with no wife living and only one daughter who could not easily travel, there had been an estate. I had received some notification at the time, a letter from a Memphis attorney that I had filed away during the chaotic weeks of Carol's infancy and Gerald's new job and the general upheaval of that year. I had dealt with it incompletely. I had assumed, in the vague, unexamined way we assume things we do not wish to investigate, that it had all been resolved. Had it been resolved? I went to the filing cabinet in the second bedroom, the room that had been Gerald's home office and was now simply a room full of his absence, and I began to look. I did not find the letter that day. I found Christmas card lists from 1994, Gerald's old tax returns, a manual for a vacuum cleaner we had replaced in 2003. But I kept looking, because something, call it instinct, call it my father's voice in the back of my head, call it the particular alertness of a woman who has recently discovered she was living inside a lie. Something told me to keep looking. I was 75 years old, newly alone, and about to have the most important month of my life. I did not know that yet, but I kept looking. The attorney's name was Susan Park. She came recommended by a woman named Helen Graves, who had been in my church choir for 20 years and whose own divorce, 8 years prior, had been handled with what Helen called surgical precision and zero sentiment. Helen said those words with evident satisfaction, and I wrote Susan Park's name on my yellow legal pad and called the next morning. Susan was in her late 40s, Korean American, with a manner that was direct without being unkind. She had short hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain, and she listened to me with the kind of focused attention that I had almost forgotten existed. When I finished explaining my situation, the 52 years, the 11-year affair, the phone call, Gerald's comment about seeing how I managed, she said calmly, "He underestimated you. That's going to cost him." I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. Susan walked me through the basics of Ohio divorce law as it applied to long-term marriages. Gerald's pension, his 401k, the equity in the house, all of it was subject to equitable distribution. The length of the marriage worked in my favor. My lack of independent income in the final years worked in my favor. The affair, while not directly relevant to asset division in Ohio's no-fault framework, would be relevant to any claims about dissipated marital assets. If Gerald had been spending marital money on Diane Holloway, and Susan said with quiet certainty that he almost certainly had been, that was documentable and consequential. "I want you to go home," Susan said, "and gather every financial document you can find. Bank statements, investment accounts, any records of large or unusual expenditures in the last 10 to 12 years. Don't remove anything from the house. Just photograph everything." I nodded. I was already thinking about the filing cabinet. What I had not anticipated was how quickly the news would travel. Carol called that evening, her voice careful and slightly strained, and asked if I had done anything yet about the divorce. I told her I had retained an attorney. There was a pause, and then she said, "Dad called me today. He said you'd gone to see a lawyer." Another pause. "He seemed surprised. Let's just see how you manage." Gerald had not expected me to move quickly. He had expected, I think, the grief and paralysis he believed were appropriate to a woman of my age and circumstances. The fact that I had acted within 2 weeks of his announcement had shifted something in his calculations. I thought about that as I drove home in the cold November dark. The fact that Gerald was already calling Carol meant he was monitoring me through her, using our daughter as a relay station for information about my movements. That was not a new dynamic. Gerald had always preferred to gather information indirectly. But now I could see it clearly, and seeing it clearly changed how I moved. The second thing happened 3 days later. I found the letter. It was not in the filing cabinet. It was in a shoebox on the top shelf of the bedroom closet. A box I had last opened, judging by the dust, sometime in the early 2000s. Inside were old photographs, a birthday card from my mother, a hospital bracelet from when Carol was born, and a letter on the letterhead of a Memphis firm. Beaumont, Greer, and Associates, attorneys at law. The date on the letter was September 14th, 1987, 3 months after my father's death. I sat down on the edge of the bed and read it. It was a formal notification from the estate of Arthur James Beaumont, my father, informing me that I was the sole beneficiary of his estate and requesting that I contact the office to initiate probate proceedings. The letter listed a partial inventory of the estate, a property in Memphis, several investment accounts, and, the phrase that made me read the sentence 3 times, additional assets under administration, the full scope of which will require further accounting. I had received this letter in September of 1987. I had been 37 years old, with a 3-year-old daughter, a husband who had just started a demanding new job, a life that felt full to overflowing. I now dimly remembered, called the number on the letter and spoken to someone, a secretary, I thought, and been told that the process would take time and that they would be in touch. They had apparently not been in touch. Or if they had, the letters had been lost in the moves, the years, the accumulating sediment of a long life. I held the letter for a long time. Then I did what my father had taught me to do. I found a clean page on my legal pad, and I wrote down every detail. Beaumont, Greer and Associates, Memphis, Tennessee, 1987. In the morning, I would search for them, and in the morning, I would find that they were still in business, reorganized, renamed, but continuous. And that when I gave the receptionist my name and my father's name and the date of his death, there was a pause on the line that lasted just long enough to mean something. "Ms. Whitfield," the woman said slowly, "could you please hold for one moment?" I held. I watched the frost on the kitchen window catch the weak November light. That pause, I understood later, was the sound of 38 years of waiting coming to an end. The attorney who came on the line after that pause was named Robert Greer, the son of the original Greer, he explained, who had taken over the practice from his father. His voice was careful in the way that voices become careful when they are managing something significant. He confirmed what the letter had suggested, and then he said something that required me to sit down. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "your father's estate was never fully distributed. There were complications, a series of legal challenges, asset structures that required extended administration, and frankly, difficulty locating you as the sole beneficiary after you moved from Memphis. We made attempts to find you over the years. The estate has continued to be managed in trust. At this point," he paused again, "I want to be precise with you. The current value of your father's estate, including the original property holdings and the growth of the investment accounts over 38 years, is approximately $73 million. I said nothing for several seconds. "Mrs. Whitfield, are you there?" "I'm here," I said. "I'm here." Robert Greer explained the next steps in the careful, methodical way of a man accustomed to delivering extraordinary information to ordinary people. There would be documentation to verify my identity and my relationship to Arthur Beaumont. There would be a formal probate process, simplified by the fact that the estate had been continuously managed and the original will was unambiguous. He estimated the process would take several months, given the size and complexity of the estate. He also said, almost as an afterthought, that there had been a competing claim on the estate in 2019. A distant cousin, a man named Douglas Beaumont, who had challenged the will on the grounds that the sole beneficiary could not be located and was presumed deceased. The challenge had been unsuccessful, but it had added procedural complexity. I wrote down the name, Douglas Beaumont. I did not tell Susan Park about the inheritance yet. Not because I distrusted her, but because I wanted to understand what I was dealing with before I introduced it into the divorce proceedings. That instinct, I believe, came from my father. Know what you have before you show your hand. But Gerald found out within the week. I do not know precisely how. Carol, I think, mentioned to Gerald that I seemed less worried than he would have expected, and Gerald, who had always been attuned to shifts in my emotional weather, began to make inquiries. His attorney contacted Susan Park with a request for a full financial disclosure that was more aggressive than the standard timeline required. Gerald himself called me twice, the second time with a particular studied casualness that told me he was fishing for information. I gave him nothing. I said my attorney was handling everything and that I would appreciate if he contacted me only through legal counsel from now on. He did not appreciate that. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Gerald arrived at the house without calling, something he had never done in our marriage, which told me how unsettled he was. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, in a voice that was almost gentle, that he had heard I had been making calls to Memphis and that he wanted to know what was going on. I told him that my financial affairs were my own, His manner shifted. Not dramatically. Gerald was never a man given to dramatic displays. But the gentleness left his voice, and something harder took its place. He reminded me that the house was jointly owned. He reminded me that any asset I had inherited during the marriage might be considered, depending on the circumstances, marital property. He said that if I was hiding something, his attorney would find it, and the consequences for me would be more complicated than necessary. Was that a threat? Sitting across the kitchen table from a man I had known for 52 years, watching him recalculate my value in real time? Yes, that was a threat. I said, "Gerald, I think you should leave." He left, but at the door he turned and said, "Peggy, I know you. You're out of your depth. Don't make this harder on yourself." I closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a moment and noticed that my hands were completely steady. Then things escalated quickly. Gerald's attorney filed a motion within days, requesting a freeze on any financial transactions pending full disclosure. Gerald also, I later learned, contacted Douglas Beaumont, the cousin who had challenged my father's estate, and the two of them had a phone call that Douglas's own attorney would later describe in deposition as exploratory. What they were exploring was whether a coordinated challenge to my claim on the Beaumont estate, combined with aggressive litigation in the divorce, could be used as leverage to force a settlement. That was not a legal maneuver. That was a pincer movement. Susan Park, when I finally told her everything, was quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay, now I understand why he moved so fast." She was not alarmed. She was, if anything, more focused. She explained that inherited assets, under Ohio law, are typically separate property, not subject to equitable distribution, unless they have been commingled with marital assets. My father's estate had never been touched, never transferred, never in any way made part of Gerald's and my shared financial life. It was mine. As for Douglas Beaumont, Robert Greer was direct. The 2019 challenge had failed. A second challenge, without new evidence, would fail again. It would take time and cost money, but it would fail. I understood all of this. And yet, sitting in my kitchen after Susan left, with the frost returning to the window and the house quiet around me, I felt the weight of what was coming. 75 years old, and I was about to fight on two fronts, a divorce and an estate challenge, against men who were organized, motivated, and had nothing to lose. I gave myself 3 days. I drove to a small motel near Yellow Springs, a place I had stayed with Carol years ago when she was young and we took weekend trips through rural Ohio. And I took my yellow legal pad and my father's letter and 3 paperback novels. And I did not answer Gerald's calls or Douglas's attorney's letters or anyone else's demands for those 3 days. I walked along the creek path in the mornings. I ate soup and bread in the small diner on the main street. I slept 8 hours a night for the first time in weeks, and on the 3rd morning, I sat on the motel bed with my legal pad, and I wrote, quietly and precisely, everything I was going to do next. I felt for the first time since the kitchen table in October, like myself again. On the last morning at the motel, I received a phone call from a number I did not recognize. The man on the line identified himself as a representative of Gerald's interests, not his attorney, but someone Gerald had apparently asked to make an informal contact. The word informal did the heavy lifting in that sentence. What this man, who gave his name as Phil Mercer and described himself as a business associate of Gerald's, actually proposed was this: that I consider a private settlement outside of formal court proceedings in which I would receive the house outright and a lump sum of $120,000 in exchange for renouncing any claim to Gerald's pension and 401k, and signing a document confirming that any assets I had personally received through inheritance were not the subject of future disputes. I sat on the edge of the motel bed in the thin November light, and I listened to all of this very carefully. Then I said, "Please tell Gerald to contact me through my attorney." Phil Mercer paused. Then, "Mrs. Whitfield, I want to be honest with you. The estate claim is going to be a long process, a very long process. Contested estates of this size can take 3 to 5 years to resolve, and the legal fees alone—" "Thank you," I said. "Please contact my attorney." I ended the call and I sat for a moment looking at the window, which framed a pale sky above the winter trees. Was I afraid? Yes. A settlement of $120,000 represented more financial security than I had expected a month ago. 3 to 5 years was a real timeline. I was 75 years old, but I also understood exactly what that phone call was. It was not a generous offer. It was a calculation. Gerald, and behind him, almost certainly, Douglas Beaumont, who had everything to gain if I abandoned the estate claim, had looked at my circumstances and decided that fear would be their best leverage. They believed that a 75-year-old woman, recently divorced, financially precarious, would be susceptible to the particular temptation of certainty. They were not entirely wrong about my circumstances, but they were entirely wrong about me. I packed my bag, paid my bill, and drove back to Dayton. On the way, I called Susan Park and told her about Phil Mercer's call. She asked me to write down everything I could remember and said she would look into whether the approach constituted any kind of improper contact. Then I called Robert Greer in Memphis and briefed him as well. He confirmed that Douglas Beaumont had retained new counsel and was, in his words, assembling a position. He said it calmly, the way a chess player describes an opponent's opening. Back in Dayton, I understood that the next phase would be different from the first. The first phase had been shock, and then the gathering of evidence, and then the initial legal moves. This phase would be patience. Gerald and Douglas would watch and wait, believing that time and financial pressure were their allies. They would conserve their energy and trust that my resources would erode. What they did not know was that I had people. This realization came to me gradually over the Thanksgiving week that followed. Helen Graves, who had recommended Susan Park, called to check on me and ended up spending 3 hours at my kitchen table helping me organize my financial documents into binders. Color-coded, tabbed, precise. Helen was 71 years old and had been through her own version of this war, and she had the calm, competent energy of a woman who had rebuilt herself from scratch and remembered every step of it. My neighbor Donna, who was 68 and a retired school teacher, began walking with me every morning at 7, not because I had asked her to, but because she had noticed the lights on in my kitchen and correctly inferred that I was not sleeping well, and she had decided, with the unceremonious practicality of a good neighbor, that walking was useful. We did not always talk about what was happening. Sometimes we just walked, and Carol, who had carried her father's secret for 2 years and bore that guilt with her everywhere, drove down from Cincinnati the Wednesday before Thanksgiving and stayed for 4 days. We cooked together. We watched old movies. We had one difficult conversation late on Thursday evening, in which she told me that she was angry at her father and that she was sorry, and I told her the truth, that she was not responsible for what he had done, and that I needed her with me, not prostrated in guilt. She cried. I did not, quite. We finished the wine and went to bed. On Friday afternoon, Carol sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Mom, $73 million. Do you understand that?" "I'm beginning to," I said. "You're going to be okay." "I know," I said. And I meant it for the first time without reservation. Gerald called once that weekend. I did not answer. He left no message. Douglas Beaumont's new attorney sent a letter to Robert Greer on Monday, outlining a series of technical challenges to the estate documentation. Robert called to tell me about it and said, in the dry way I had come to appreciate, "He's delaying. He has no new evidence. He's delaying." I wrote that down on my legal pad. He is delaying. He has no new evidence. Then I wrote, "Patience is also a weapon." I was cold and clear and ready. Gerald was watching. Douglas was maneuvering. And I was, very quietly, building the case that would dismantle them both. They came on a Sunday afternoon, 3 days before Christmas. I had not expected Gerald to come in person. His attorney had been handling everything through Susan Park, and I had grown accustomed to the managed distance of legal correspondence. Letters that were careful and cold and technically precise. The directness of him appearing at my front door, with Diane Holloway waiting in the car at the curb, was so startling that I stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. Gerald looked older than he had in October. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before, and he was wearing a coat I didn't recognize. A new one, I thought, something Diane had chosen. He held a small paper bag, the kind bakeries used, and he held it out to me with an expression I had not seen from him in years, something that resembled humility. "Peggy," he said, "can we talk?" I stepped back and let him in. Not because I trusted what he was doing. I understood, with an immediate and complete clarity, that this visit was not what it appeared to be, but because I wanted to hear it. I wanted to know what form the manipulation would take. He sat at the kitchen table. I made tea because having something to do with my hands felt important. He set the bakery bag between us. It contained 2 scones I saw, the kind from the bakery near what used to be our church. And he looked around the kitchen with an expression that might have been nostalgia, if I had been inclined to read it that way. "I've been thinking," he said, "about how this has gone, and I don't feel good about it." I said nothing. I poured the tea. "I handled it badly," he continued. "The way I told you. The timing. I think I was not kind." Here was the thing about Gerald. He was not unintelligent, and he was not entirely without self-awareness. He knew how to make an apology sound sincere. He had been doing it for 52 years, and he had learned which notes to strike and which ones to avoid. "I want us to find a way through this that doesn't destroy everything," he said. "I've been talking to—" He paused, and in that pause I watched him decide how much to reveal. "I've spoken to someone about the estate situation. Your father's estate. And I just want you to know that I don't have any interest in making that harder for you." So there it was. He knew. He knew. And he was here to tell me he knew, which was itself a kind of pressure. A demonstration that he had information, that he was inside my situation in ways I might not have realized. "Gerald," I said, "what do you want?" He looked at his tea. "I want us to settle this civilly, without years of litigation, without Carol being caught in the middle. I think if we sat down together—" "With Diane waiting in the car?" He blinked. Then, "She drove me." "I know she drove you. What exactly are you proposing?" And then the mask slipped, just for a moment. Just enough. He leaned forward slightly, and his voice changed, dropping the careful, rueful note and acquiring something sharper. "Peggy, you're 75 years old. The estate case is going to take years. The legal fees on something this size are— I've had someone look into this. They're going to be substantial. What if you walked away from all of this with enough to live comfortably and easily for the rest of your life? A real settlement, real money, and none of the—" "I have real money," I said. "I have my father's estate." "You have a claim," he said, "that you haven't proven yet." I set down my teacup. I looked at the man I had been married to for 52 years, and I felt, with absolute precision, what he was doing. He was not here to apologize. He was here to frighten me, wrapped in the performance of conciliation. He was here to make me feel the weight of uncertainty and time and my own age, to make me feel that a comfortable retreat was better than a difficult victory. He was here, in short, because he was afraid. "Gerald," I said, "I think you should finish your tea and go." Something moved across his face. "Peggy, I'm not settling. I'm not withdrawing any claim. I'm not signing anything that limits my rights to my father's estate. And if Douglas Beaumont has asked you to carry this message, you can tell him that my attorneys will be in contact with his." The name landed. I watched Gerald go very still. He had not known, until that moment, that I knew about the connection between him and Douglas. The slight widening of his eyes, the microsecond of recalibration. I had not imagined it. He stood up. He was not aggressive. Gerald was never physically aggressive. But the remnant of warmth in his manner evaporated entirely, and what replaced it was something colder. "You're making a mistake," he said. "I don't think I am." He left the scones on the table. He walked to the door, and at the door he paused in the same spot he had paused in October, and turned back to look at me. He was trying, I think, to find something to say that would restore his advantage, some final word that would leave me uncertain. He did not find it. He left. I stood in the kitchen and I listened to his car pull away from the curb. Then I sat down and I looked at the 2 scones in the bakery bag, and I thought, he came here with bakery scones and a prepared speech, and the assumption that I would be grateful for the attention. And then I felt it. A small current of genuine fear threading through the clarity. Because Gerald was not a foolish man, and if he had come in person, if he had tolerated the indignity of that performance, it meant that something in their position was under real pressure. That was reassuring, but it also meant they were growing more active, not less. I called Susan Park that evening and told her everything. She listened, asked 2 or 3 focused questions, and then said, "Good. You did exactly right. And Peggy, the fact that he came, that tells us something. We're winning." I wrote that down. We are winning. I believed it. And the fear, rather than weakening me, tightened my resolve to the consistency of iron. The deposition took place on a Wednesday, 3 months after Gerald had appeared at my door with his bakery scones and his performance of regret. It had taken that long because Gerald's attorney had filed 2 motions to delay, both of which the court had denied. Douglas Beaumont's attorney, operating in the Memphis probate court simultaneously, had made 3 separate procedural challenges to the estate documentation, all of which Robert Greer had answered with what he described as patient, systematic refutation. The strategy on their side was transparently dilatory. Every delay cost me legal fees. Every additional month was a month in which they hoped my resolve or my resources might crack. Neither cracked. The conference room at Susan's office was spare and well lit, with a long table and chairs, and a court reporter at one end with her equipment. Gerald arrived with his attorney, a man named Craig Whitmore, who was in his 50s and had the practiced authority of someone who had sat at many such tables. Douglas Beaumont did not attend. He was present by phone, his voice occasionally audible through a speaker at one end of the table, his attorney's eyes occasionally moving to the phone in a way that told me they had discussed strategy in advance. I sat across the table from Gerald. He looked, I thought, genuinely tired. Not the theatrical tiredness of October, not the performance of October's bakery visit, but the real tiredness of a man who had been managing a complicated situation for months and had discovered that it was not resolving the way he had planned. Diane Holloway was not present. She had never been present in any of the formal proceedings, which I took as evidence that Gerald had at least enough remaining judgment to keep her out of this particular room. Susan Park sat beside me with a folder of documents, very still and entirely calm. The deposition began with Gerald. Susan asked her questions with the unhurried precision I had come to rely on. Each question placing one more weight on a scale that had been tipping, slowly but consistently, against Gerald for months. The financial records were the architecture of the case. Gerald's 401k statements showing an account balance that had grown substantially during the years of the affair. His credit card records, subpoenaed at Susan's request, showing regular expenditures in Columbus that corresponded to documented visits to Diane Holloway, hotel charges, restaurant receipts, 2 jewelry purchases in 2018, marital assets spent on another woman during a marriage that he had represented to me as fundamentally intact until the moment he decided otherwise. Gerald's answers were careful at first. Whitmore objected at intervals. Standard procedure. Nothing Susan had not anticipated. But as the questions moved deeper into the financial timeline, I watched something happen that I had not expected. Gerald began to lose the thread. Not dramatically, not in the way it happens in films, where a witness breaks down under pressure. It was subtler than that. He started to give answers that didn't quite align with previous answers. He corrected himself twice. He said, "I don't recall 11 times in 40 minutes, which Susan noted aloud with a quiet precision that made Whitmore shift in his chair. Then Susan introduced the communication records. She had subpoenaed Gerald's email records as part of discovery, a request that Whitmore had challenged and lost. Among those records was a thread between Gerald and Douglas Beaumont. A thread that began, significantly, in November, shortly after I had retained Robert Greer, and that documented, in Gerald's own words, a coordinated strategy. If the estate claim could be contested long enough to exhaust my resources, and if the divorce settlement could be structured to limit my access to interim funds, I would be in a position where accepting a reduced settlement was not a choice, but a necessity. "She doesn't have the stamina for a long fight," Gerald had written in an email dated November 23rd. "We just have to make it long enough." Susan read that sentence aloud. She did not comment on it. She simply read it. I looked at Gerald across the table. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment. I did not feel triumph. Not yet. I felt something more like sorrow, the particular sorrow of confirmation, of having a suspicion ratified in full. He had never believed I could do this. He had looked at 75 years of living and seen only limitation, and he had bet on it, and he had put that bet in writing. And now it was on a conference room table in the cold January light. The phone speaker at the end of the table crackled. Douglas Beaumont's voice. "I think we should take a break." Whitmore agreed. We took a break. In the hallway, Susan turned to me with a look I had not seen from her before. Not the steady professional calm, but something warmer. "He wrote it down," she said. "He actually wrote it down." "I know," I said. "He thought it was strategy, it's evidence." When we returned to the table, the dynamic had shifted in a way that everyone in the room could feel. Whitmore was more circumspect. Gerald was quieter. The phone at the end of the table was silent. Douglas Beaumont had apparently muted himself, possibly on instruction from his own attorney. Susan spent the next hour walking through the financial documentation with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had nothing to hide and knew it. The total value of marital assets Gerald had proposed to exclude from division. The dissipation of marital funds, a legal term for marital money spent on the affair, which she calculated at over $40,000 across 11 years. The 401k that Gerald had transferred in a move his own attorney had authorized. to an account in his sole name 3 days after announcing the divorce. A transfer that, under Ohio law, was precisely the kind of action that courts viewed with significant disapproval. Gerald's composure, which had held for the first hour, was gone by the end. He was not loud. He was never loud. But he was pale and contained in the way of a man who has understood, finally, the full nature of what he walked into. "Is that all?" he said at the end, to no one in particular. "For today," Susan said. I gathered my coat and my bag. I looked at Gerald one last time. The table between us, the court reporter shutting down her equipment, the pale January light through the windows. "What do you actually have?" he had asked me in October. I thought, more than you counted on. The divorce settlement was reached in February, 6 weeks after the deposition. Gerald did not want to go to trial. Craig Whitmore had advised against it. The emails, the financial records, the documented dissipation of marital assets, the 401k transfer made 3 days into the proceedings. The case Susan had assembled was not merely adequate, it was comprehensive. The settlement gave me the house in full. Gerald's pension was split 60-40 in my favor, reflecting both the length of the marriage and the court's adverse view of the asset transfer. His 401k, valued at approximately $340,000, was divided equally. The $40,000 in documented marital dissipation was added to my portion. I was awarded legal fees. Gerald moved into a rental in Columbus near Diane Holloway's apartment. He signed the papers on a Tuesday, and that was the end of 52 years. I did not feel what I had expected to feel. I had anticipated something dramatic, relief, vindication. What I felt was quieter, a settling, like a building that has been under stress for months and finally finds its footing. I sat in the kitchen, drank coffee, looked out at the winter yard and thought, it's done. The estate proceedings moved quickly after that. Douglas Beaumont's position, already purely technical, collapsed entirely without Gerald's litigation as ongoing pressure. Robert Greer filed the final documentation in March. I flew to Memphis for the first time in nearly 40 years. I had not expected the city to move me. But flying in over the Mississippi on a gray March morning, seeing the familiar flatness of the land, something opened in me that I had not known was closed. I walked through the neighborhood where I had grown up, past the church, past the elementary school, past the small park where my father had taken me on Sunday afternoons. The hearing itself was brief. The documentation was in order. The challenge had been withdrawn. $73,412,000. Robert Greer shook my hand in the courthouse hallway. "Your father would be glad," he said. He had wanted me to have it. He had put it in writing in 1982, 5 years before he died. Every cent to Peggy, his girl, because she would know what to do with it. He had trusted me with it across decades and distance and all the things that happen in a life. Back in Dayton, I called Carol. She cried. I did too this time. Douglas Beaumont attempted one final challenge in April. It was denied in 48 hours. I read the notification over breakfast, opened the window to let in the April air, cut grass, something flowering on the street, and thought about what to do with the rest of my life. I was 75 years old. I had a house, I had a daughter, I had my father's estate, and 52 years of experience with being underestimated. I had, it turned out, quite a lot. The first thing I did was take Carol to Memphis. We flew down in May, when the gardens were in full color, and I showed her the neighborhood where I had grown up, the park, the church, the house her grandfather had owned. We stood on the front porch, and I told her about Arthur Beaumont. The real version, not the abbreviated figure who had existed at the edge of her childhood as a name and a photograph. She held my hand and said, I wish I had known him. He would have loved you, I said, and I believed it entirely. In June, I established a trust. A third went to philanthropy, education, and women's economic independence. The rest was split between long-term investment and liquid funds, ready to be lived with. I established a scholarship at my Memphis high school in my father's name, the Arthur James Beaumont Scholarship for first-generation college students. I stood at the podium and was not, for once in my adult life, tentative about taking up space. I bought an apartment in Cincinnati to be near Carol. I kept the Dayton house. Helen and I traveled, Savannah, New Mexico, then Portugal in the fall. We walked a great deal, sat in cafes, and talked across long afternoons with the freedom of women who have survived considerable difficulty and arrived somewhere on the other side of it. I was 76 years old on the Tagus River at dusk, thinking about my father and about what it means to receive something that has been waiting for you for 38 years. Now, Gerald. He and Diane had moved in together in Columbus. By July, it was strained. She had known him as a man with ease and a full wallet. She was discovering him diminished. By October, they had separated. Carol mentioned it carefully, watching my face. I told her I was sorry, and I meant it, not with sympathy for what he had done, but with the unsentimental sorrow of someone who watched a person choose something smaller than what they had. Douglas Beaumont had been ordered to pay a portion of the estate's legal fees. He was contesting it. It would not go well for him. In December, I sat around Carol's dinner table in the warm light, her husband, her children, the whole living result of all the years, and felt something simple and complete. I was 76 years old. I had more mornings than I could count. I intended to use every one of them. What do you actually have? Gerald had asked. Everything, I thought. Everything I need, and then some. My father waited 38 years to give me what was mine. Gerald waited 52 years to show me who he truly was. Both, in the end, kept their promises. What I learned: a woman is never out of options until she decides she is. Patience and clarity are not passive. They are the sharpest tools available. And the people who tell you that you have nothing are almost always the ones who are afraid of what you might do with everything. What would you have done in that kitchen when the phone went quiet? I'd love to know. Leave a comment, and thank you, truly, for listening to my story.